So Psalm 127 is interestingly uh, describing children and likening children with an arrow. And at some point, I was like, okay, if the Bible talks about in the very last verse of that chapter, which is verse 5, and the Bible refers to children uh, and likens them to an arrow. And then at the same time, the Bible now talks about contending with enemies at the gate. Then it gives me a sense that there's some kind of warfare happening. And the truth is, we're within a context where there's some kind of warfare. There's a battle between light and darkness, there's battle between truth and lies, there's battle and contention on many grounds. However, the Bible refers to children and likens them to an arrow. And as I think about it, I wonder how so many people, or how most people, perceive their children. And when I think about growing up, I would say we have been raised to be defenders. We've been raised to be like shields rather than raised to be like arrows. We're raised to be like shields. Now we're trained and we're told, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. So we're raised with a framework of do's and don'ts. But as I think about the Bible referring to children and likening children to arrows in the hands of a warrior, I am forced to think about the fact that when you have an arrow, a blunt arrow is of no use. So arrows need to be sharpened. Arrows need to be properly positioned. Arrows will need to be properly galvanized. And arrows are not used for shielding. Rather, arrows are used to cause some kind of havoc. And I know that a lot of children over the years grow up with mentality that we are not supposed to do this and do that. And it's for me a shield mentality. But as I think about the changing context, especially the fact that uh, you will not always be with your children, how are you raising them? How are you enabling them to grow up and have the mindset of knowing how to make choices? How are you training them within the context of rather than peer pressure influencing them or affecting them? They are able to peer mentor others. So, in a world where parents are afraid of peer mentoring, for me, I think that is some sort of peer pressure. I think that is some sort of a defensive mentality. But an offensive mechanism for that is raising your children to believe that wherever they find themselves, they are mentors for other children. And I think that's the flip side of peer pressure, that your kids have the capacity to mentor other children, even those older than them. And I think that does not happen by magic. That has to happen with intentionality in how you raise them. That has to happen with intentionality in how you infuse the mentality that they understand that they are supposed to be in whatever space they find themselves, they are leaders. In whatever space that they find themselves, they should understand that there is a stake, there is a warfare, and that warfare is a warfare of ideologies. So, if we understand that God has given us children and He has placed children within the context of family with a simple mandate that they are wired to be arrows, they are wired to cause some kind of havoc within whatever context that they find themselves. And you're able to raise them with that kind of mentality. They are able to come to those spaces with an understanding that they're first and foremost arrows. and they are not there to be afraid of do's and don'ts and be afraid of how they are really supposed to carry themselves. But they should understand that there is an expectation. So it is either they are influencing, it is either they are causing change, it is either they are framing the conversation within that space, or they are not existing. And as I think about this, I think about the boy Moses. And Moses is an interesting character when you read the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2 will leave you thinking, what kind of a child is Moses? Because the very opening, it tells us about the family background of Moses. Exodus chapter 2, it tells us that Moses was given birth to by a father and a mother that were both Levites. But what we find there is the intentionality in how the mother preserved him right from the very moment that she gave birth to him. And she understood that Moses was coming into a context of hostility. But the Bible tells us something about how the mom perceived him, that she preserved him not for anything, but for the fact that the Lord had shown her that Moses was a fine child, that Moses was a beautiful child. And we see that in verse 2 of Exodus chapter 2. The Bible says, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. And the question for me always when I think about child rearing and when I think about shaping young people and shaping children to be able to live within this context of hostility and be arrows, one of the things I wonder is what do we see when we look at our children and the power of vision. Some of us growing up, the only thing that people around us, a lot of people around us could see is that we were stubborn. People could see that we were not going to amount to anything. People could see that our lives were useless. However, there are people who, when they looked at us, they knew that God's hands was upon us. And they knew that if they do not take deliberateness and intentionality in shaping our lives and enabling us to see and understand that we're arrows, they knew that the devil would definitely use us to cause havoc to the kingdom of light. And as I think about this, the question then is how do you perceive your children? And the Bible tells us that children are not shields. Children are not for defense. Children are supposed to be wired in such a way, they're supposed to be shaped, supposed to be raised in such a way that they understand that they have a mandate, and the mandate is that they cause influence. And when you don't raise your children with this basic understanding of the fact that they are influencers, they possess the power to cause change, they possess the power to make a difference for the right reasons, the devil will definitely use them to contend against you at the gate. And the Bible says they will contend with our enemies at the gate. But what if the enemy has gotten a hold of your kids? The enemy will make them contend with you at the gate. And we're seeing many societies around the world, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, many societies have lost hold of their children because they have lost the vision of understanding that children are likened to arrows. With the recent killing of children in school, you wonder how do you explain such a phenomenon? It's basically because a lot of children have not been raised to understand their place. They've lost a vision of being arrows for the right reason. Right now, the enemy uses them for the wrong reason. So I want to leave you with these thoughts. I want to leave you with this thought. And it's nothing outside the box, but it's for you to think about the fact that are you raising your children to be arrows or are you raising them to shields? Are you simply stating to your children do's and don'ts, or are you helping them and enabling them to understand that Wherever they find themselves, they are leaders and they should make decisions as leaders. They should understand that they are influencers. Are you raising your children to be afraid of peer pressures, or are you raising them to understand that they have the capacity to peer mentor their colleagues, their contemporaries? And if we understand this, it goes a long way to help us to be intentional on how we raise our children. It helps us to come up with blueprints of how children and young people basically can be raised to understand that they possess power to cause influence. They possess power to change narratives. They possess power to shape conversations and to lead their generation. And I know that there are children out there that all we just need to do is to invest in them rightly, and we will have the right result because they will turn out to contend with the enemy of the church, they will contend with the enemy of their families, they will contend with the enemy of the society. And the enemy of the church, the enemy of the family, the enemy of the society is no other person but the devil who is at work causing pains. But when children are raised, they become like Josephs who would go ahead and they would design blueprints, design systems that would salvage the world from dying from famine. They will salvage the world from dying from the ideologies that are destructive. They will salvage the world with innovative ideas that will cause amazing businesses to spring up. So I would pick up this same conversation and I would lead it forward because I think it's important that we understand this foundational idea of how young people should be raised to perceive themselves not as shields, not as defenders, but rather likened to arrows in the hands of the warrior. And this conversation will lead us to a lot of other issues that we will look at right here on the I conversation. I'm happy I've been able to share this with you. If you like it, share this with others, and I hope you make a whole lot of sense and you get a lot of benefit from this conversation. Thank you so much for joining, and God bless you.